talk about here on our last couple of days, okay? So let's jump into it. And once again, I'm just going to kind of share some notes. Maybe we'll see if maybe my iPad screen here will work better in a few minutes. Okay, so first off, let's just begin by talking about why economists believe trade is such a good thing. And, you know, we have talked about this on a number of occasions, this block, but it's always worth just kind of reiterating why economists so strongly believe that trade is a good thing. And, you know, as I think I've talked about, if you ask the public really has very mixed feelings about trade, right? About 50% of the public think that trade is a good thing, and about 50% of the public think that trade is a bad thing, and the U.S. could actually be made better off by not trading as much. Among economists, it's about 100 to 0 think that trade is a good thing. And so we've talked about why this is. The most important is this idea of comparative advantage or specialization, right? We talked about this the second day of class, how countries can benefit by specializing in what they do best, right? By specializing in what they do best. And so, you know, I mean, I don't think I have to belabor this point, right? We've talked about this over and over again. We've also talked about this idea of economies of scale, right? And economies of scale basically mean you can keep your costs lower by producing more. Keep your costs lower by producing more. This is particularly important for smaller countries, right? So if you're a small country, right, what's the possibility that you could have your own automobile manufacturer? Very little, because basically you have to be making about 1 million cars a year to have the scale of production needed to be efficient. And so, however, many small countries actually do have automobile manufacturers. They just export, right? They export. It gives them access to bigger markets, and as a result, they can increase the scale of their production. Technology transfer, right? How do poor countries, we know that technology is one of the keys to increasing productivity. How do we get more technology? Borrow it from other countries. How do we borrow it? By trading with them, right? So technology transfer through trade is a hugely important part of why trade is beneficial. And then finally, there's some argument, I don't know exactly how much I believe this, but there is some argument that trade encourages better institutions to the extent that when you compete with richer countries, you have to basically play by their rules. And a lot of their rules mean encouraging better legal systems, including better trading systems, including maybe more information sharing, and the things that can possibly increase institutions. So as we've talked about before, and you know, I won't kind of reiterate all the data, but there is a lot of data that suggests that countries that trade more are richer, right? And we talked about this in chapter 9, when we talked about one of the biggest factors of good institutions is countries that are open to trade, right? Countries that are open to trade have better institutions. So what we live in now has often been referred to as the era of globalization. And globalization means the growth of international trade, and I actually should put here financial linkages, because globalization is about trade, but it's also about financial flows, the movement of money across borders, right? So it's the growth of trade, but it's also the movement of money across borders. And so here, if you look between what's happened in 1870 and 2017, you can see the big growth on the left-hand side here. You can see the big growth of international trade as a percent of world GDP. So today, trade is about 50% of world GDP. About half of all the goods and services produced are actually traded across countries. Some countries have trade that's 80, 90% of GDP, right? In other words, 80 to 90% of what's produced in their country actually gets traded across borders. If you look across countries, you can kind of see a similar thing. Like look at Belgium, right? Belgium, their imports and exports are over 80% of GDP, right? So most of the things that Belgium produces are sold outside of Belgium. Most of the things that Belgium consumes are sold inside or are produced outside of Belgium, right? So, you know, many, particularly in small countries, you can see the extent to which they rely on international trade. As we're going to talk about, the US is actually a relatively closed economy in the sense that trade is a smaller portion of GDP in the US than it is in most other countries, in large part for two reasons. One, the US is very big, right? So bigger countries tend to rely on trade less, which makes sense, right? Because a bigger economy can be a more diversified economy. And then also there's just the geographic reality of the US, that we're relatively isolated from most countries, right? I mean, we have Canada and Mexico at our border, but most countries have many more than just two border countries, right? And so having oceans on both sides has always kind of isolated the US to some extent from trade. What defines globalization, right? If as an economist, when economists think about globalization, what defines it? What's driving it, right? How do we really characterize globalization? Well, I think there's a few things to say about globalization. Some of these I think you probably understand. Some of these you might understand a little bit, but maybe you don't understand the extent to which some of these phenomena are happening. First off, globalization is really driven by technology. Okay? Globalization is driven by technology, like a lot of things in economics. A lot of it is information technology. And by this, I don't just mean, well, countries are trading computers. It's much more than that. Countries are trading information. There's so much more information out there that allows countries to trade across borders, right? So if you go back to the 1980s when China was just opening up, there used to be, you know, there's some great books written by business people who basically started small companies in China and tried to link up Chinese companies with American companies. And it was like the Wild West, like trying to figure out these small Chinese companies that could maybe build a little thing for you in the United States, right? And it was very complicated because most people didn't know much about China and the information was, you know, not out there and you didn't know who you could trust or whatever. Today, how hard is it to get a widget made in China? You can do it in like 45 minutes, right? I mean, the ease of using information technology and brokers that will help you find companies in China to make a certain part is, I mean, it's just astronomical how much easier it's become. So information technology, and particularly the information part of this, is a big part of what's driving trade. But then there's also technologies that aren't maybe necessarily as obvious. Shipping containers, right? The cargo shipping container is one of the most important innovations of the age of globalization, right? How much does it cost to get a ton of merchandise from Shanghai to Los Angeles on a shipping container? To get a ton of merchandise, about $120, right? It's that cheap. So the standardized shipping container, right? That can be, you pack everything in it, put on a truck, dropped off to the port has a crane, puts it on a ship. The ship makes the very long and slow, but very cost-effective trip to the US, picks up on a trip, on a train or a crane, dropped on a truck, delivered. That is an amazingly cheap and efficient process. And so this is one of the reasons why we trade so much more with countries like China, because it's actually much cheaper because of innovations such as shipping containers. Trade, though, has also been driven by the fact that countries are more open than they used to be. Sorry, I'm going to switch masks. This mask is kind of driving me nuts. All right, maybe this one's a little bit better. You see it has, my mom made this for me. This is really sad. My mom made this for me. It has dollar signs on it. It's pathetic. It's my backup mask, sorry. But this one is making me nuts. Okay, so many more countries have essentially opened up. And this is because, what have we learned as economists? That countries that trade more are richer. And so many countries, as a specific, focus of development policy, have begun to open up. And so look at the percentage of countries here, the number of countries that have joined the World Trade System. And you can see the incredible growth of countries joining the World Trade System, basically saying, we're going to open up the trade, right? And so a lot of this is policy too, right? Globalization is also about policy. It's not just technology, but it's the fact that, countries want to be trading more. And so, for instance, in countries like China or South Korea or Hong Kong or Singapore, a big part of their development was these free trade zones, basically having parts of their country that were specifically built around international trade, right? Where companies that wanted to trade internationally with China could locate. And so, this has been a big part of the story too of globalization, because it hasn't just happened because of technology. It's happened purposefully because countries have looked to trade more. Why? Because we know that countries that trade more get richer. And what happens is they get richer. They begin to trade different kinds of things, right? So, here you see the share of apparel imports, right? And you can see what's happened in the United States. So this is imports to the United States, I should be clear. So look like what happened back in 1990, where 16% of clothing came from Hong Kong. Today, it's almost zero, right? And where do we get our clothing today? Well, Bangladesh, right? This is the way that the trade has changed over time. Why isn't Hong Kong making so much apparel? Because now they've moved into higher value goods like finance or technology. So, this is Hong Kong moving up that technology ladder through growth and through trade. There's an element of taste to this too, right? We have a much more globalized society than we used to, right? There's no doubt that if you look at what's happening in the United States, and part of this is information technology, but there's a bunch of microcultures, right? I mean, I see this with I have a daughter who's a first year in college as well. And, what does she do on the weekends? She watches a lot of anime, right? She listens to Brazilian music, and she likes to cook Japanese, right? And part of this is, through information technology and just through a more globalized economy, we have access to a lot of these things, right? We have access to Japanese movies and different types of music and whatever. And so our tastes have changed in many ways. Now, here's those things you probably somewhat understood. Something else, though, that's driving globalization that's probably less understood is this whole idea of global supply chains. It is not the case that goods are made in any single country anymore. For the most part, most goods are not made in a single country. So when we talk about global supply chains, we're talking about the fact that goods are not specialized at the final level, but they're specialized at individual stages of production. What does this mean? It means it's almost impossible to tell what's an import or what's an export or what's an American good or what's a Chinese good anymore. Right? It's almost impossible to tell. So here's the classic example, an iPad, right? Very much like the one I have here that's not working, right? So here's an iPad. Now, what is an iPad to the United States? It's actually an import. it's actually an import from China. Why? Because the final stage of production of an iPad is done in China. However, if you look at where the value added of this iPad comes from, in other words, where are these individual stages of production, right? They're all over the globe. They're all over the globe. So while it's an export from China, if you look here, China only puts about 8% of that price of an iPad is actually the work that value is added in China, only about 8%. Where does most of the value from an iPad come? Well, most of it actually goes to Apple, right? About $150 of that iPad goes directly to Apple. So even though we call it an import to the US, actually it's a US company, to the extent we can call Apple a US company. It's a US company that gets the biggest share of that price. Who else gets it? Well, you know, there's different components that are worldwide that are impossible to price. The European Union gets 1%, Taiwan 7%, Japan 7%, South Korea 34%. So South Korea is getting 3 times the amount of China does, but yet we consider it an export from China. So in this world of global supply chains, you know, this whole idea of exports and imports really stops making sense, right? In the sense that we call things exports and imports, but that's really only based on where they were finally put together, right? In terms of the value added, it just doesn't make much sense. You know, here's another example of this. Let me shrink this a bit. Somehow I copied this cockeyed. But this is looking at a Boeing 787, right? Which is the final stages of assembly is done in the United States. So this would be an American product. But if you actually look at all the different components of this airplane, almost none of them are made in the United States, right? Almost none of this plane is made in the United States. It's just essentially assembled here in the United States and designed in the United States. So, you know, to the wingtips, to the leading edges, to the fuselage, to the main landing gear, I mean, it's made all over the world, right? In what sense is this an American product? It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. Part of the reason why it's hard to say what's American and what's foreign anymore, what's an import and what's an export, is because of the increasingly growth of multinational corporations, which really don't have a home, right? What's true about most multinational corporations? They both import and export. They both import and export. So in other words, if we look across the world, we see that the same firms are both the biggest importers and the biggest exporters. So this is a little hard to read, but I'll just tell you what it says. It says if you look at the top 1% of US exporters, okay, so the top 1% biggest US exporters, what's true about them? 90% of that top 1% are also importers, right? Let me say that again. The biggest exporters are also importers. And the opposite is true. If you look at the biggest importers, 96% of them are also exporters. So you cannot separate exports from imports, American goods from Chinese goods, you know, nearly to the extent that some politicians want you to think you can. This is why a lot of this trade rhetoric that's happened over the last 4 or 6 years is so completely devoid of how things work in the real world, right? This idea that, well, let's just stop buying things from China. What does that mean? What does that really mean? Stop buying iPads, right? Who are we hurting if we stop buying iPads? Well, who we're hurting the most is an American company, Apple, to the extent Apple's an American company, right? So, you know, there's so much nationalistic rhetoric about trade that goes on out there. But as I said, so much of it is just devoid of reality. That in reality, it's really hard to say what's an import and what's an export. It's very difficult to say exactly what the US trade deficit is, because the way that we measure imports and exports is really fundamentally flawed, right? You know, it would be great if we could do this for every single good that came across a country's borders. Like, could you potentially take every single good and say, well, 1% should go to Japan, and 2% should go to South Korea? And I mean, you could. The problem is that's going to be extremely difficult, right? If you think about the billions of dollars of goods that are going between countries, it's going to be impossible to do this. I mean, you could do this for a Boeing 787 because, you know, that's a big expensive thing. But for most small goods, you know, they come from so many different places that it just becomes too big of a job to kind of chase down the data for all of these things. So anyway, the world economy is a much more complicated place than most people give it credit for, right? And particularly critics of trade just don't seem to understand the very nature of production anymore. They don't understand the basics of economics. The US, as I said, is still somewhat unusual in that we relative to the rest of the world, we actually trade a small amount. So if you look up here, this dotted line is the world's trade as a percentage of GDP. So now the world, about, as I said, about 50% of world GDP is conducted through trade, either exports or imports. The US, though, is down, you know, closer to 30%. So the US actually trades less on average than the world does. And, you know, part of that is just because the US is a big economy, right? Big economies don't trade as much as small economies, in part because we don't have to, right? We can, you know, we have, it's by being big, it's a lot easier for us to be diversified, right? We're not as reliant on comparative advantage as a small country like Belgium would be. So after all of this is said, let's talk a little bit then about why is protectionism so popular right now, right? If there's so little reality to this idea that the US can benefit from protectionism or benefit from trading less, then why is it so popular? Well, let me say, one of the reasons it's so popular is because understanding the economics of this is very easy to get confused, right? Many smart people have fundamentally misunderstood the economics of this, including Abraham Lincoln, right? So when Lincoln was president, there was this, they were building the Transcontinental Railroad, right? And so somebody asked Lincoln, well, should we build the railroad ties ourselves or should we buy them from England? And Lincoln said this. Lincoln said, it seems, actually, I'll throw you up the quote. It seems to me that if we buy the rails in England, then we've got the rails and they've got the money. But if we build the rails here, we've got the rails and we've got the money. What's the problem with that thinking? Wait, if they build it in England, and we get the rails, they get the money. But if we build it here, we get the rails, we get the money. What's the problem with that? Come on, you economists, what's the problem with that? There's a big gaping hole in that logic. Exactly, there's an opportunity cost, right? I mean, we don't just make rails out of thin air. We have to not make something else to make rails, right? There's an opportunity cost to everything that we produce. That's what Lincoln didn't think about here. That when we make rails, what were we giving up? The opportunity to produce something else, something that we might be better at. That's the whole part, or that's the whole idea of comparative advantage. And so I bring this up because it goes to show you how seemingly, you know, like when Lincoln says it like this, it's like, oh, that seems so straightforward. Yeah, of course he's right, right? But you have to think about this stuff. for it to be clear why it's wrong. And I think that's really, that is at the root of a lot of protectionist arguments, is if you don't think too hard, they sound good. But once you start thinking about them, they don't sound so good. For instance, this idea that trade costs jobs, right? That's one of the things you hear all the time, that trade costs jobs. Of course, we know that trade doesn't cost jobs in total, but it does cost some people their jobs. So in other words, trade does cost jobs, but it creates other jobs. But what do people tend to focus on? They tend to focus on the jobs that are lost, and they don't see the jobs that are created, right? So when we, for instance, when the US entered the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, everybody focused on the jobs that were lost in the apparel industry, right? So people in North Carolina lost their jobs because now more clothing was going to be made down in Mexico. What didn't they think about? All the jobs that were created in information technology because of our trade with Mexico, right? So, as we've talked about, this is the problem. This is one of the problems with trade. It creates this special interest problem that a lot of people benefit, but some people lose. And those people who lose have a lot of incentive to vote on one issue and to get their representatives to vote on one issue. Okay? And so, while trade is good in an aggregate, it's not going to be good for every single individual. And that creates this special interest problem that is at the heart of a lot of complaints about trade. Okay, one that I hear a lot is the US can't compete with low-wage countries. Right? We can't compete with low-wage countries. Wages are so low in different countries that we simply can't compete with them. What's the problem with this argument? Listen, this one is even easier to refute. If low wages was the key thing, then where would every country be moving to? Haiti. Right? Every American country would move to Haiti if low wages was the only thing. In fact, they're not moving to Haiti. Why? Because what do low wages reflect? Low productivity. Here you can see productivity and wages. And what do we see? Wages are high when productivity is high, and wages are low when productivity is low. So why aren't companies moving to Haiti? Because there's a reason why wages are so low. If given the choice, what would firms prefer? Low wages and low productivity, or high wages and high productivity? High wages and high productivity, right? Firms would prefer productivity over wages any day of the week. And so this idea that firms only think about wages is just not consistent with how firms actually think about these things, right? And why are wages high in a place like Switzerland? Because they have, as we've talked about, the physical capital, the human capital, and the technology. And why do they have those things? Because of institutions, right? Those are the things that encourage firms to produce. Low wages is not something that really encourages a firm to go relocate, right? So it sounds good, right? Once again, on first blush, it's like, yeah, of course firms would like to have lower wages. Until you begin to think about things, right? Until you begin to think about things a little bit more clearly. And you see it's not just about wages, it's also about productivity. Well, this is one of the reasons why low-wage countries want to trade more, is because trade allows them the opportunity to increase their productivity and increase wages, right? So the attraction of trade, particularly for poor countries, is not to take advantage of being a low-wage country. It's to become a high-wage country, which is what countries that have done a lot of trade here over the last 20 or 30 years have done, right? For instance, China. right? China has, over time, become a higher and higher wage country. And what's happened as its wages have gone up, it's actually trading more, right? Why? Because those higher wages reflect stronger productivity. That's what really matters, right? That's what really matters. So, you know, focusing on wages is kind of like focusing on the symptom rather than the cause, right? Low wages are a symptom of a not very productive economy, right? They're a symptom of a not very productive economy. All right, a lot of people like this idea of national security, right? That we need to make our own stuff. We can't rely on other countries for some of the things we need. Well, you know, once again, I think there's a lot of problems with this. One of the problems is just, okay, let's get real about which countries tend to want subsidies or want protection from trade, right? They're usually not countries, not things that are particularly in the national interest. They tend to be things that don't have comparative advantage, right? So for instance, can you believe that the US actually subsidizes wool? Why do we subsidize wool? Because if we didn't subsidize wool, then we would end up buying all of our wool from New Zealand. And what happens if we get into a war with New Zealand? Then we're going to have naked soldiers and we'll lose. I mean, that's basically the argument, right? It doesn't smell right, right? It doesn't smell right. We subsidize scissor manufacturing in the United States. Why? Because you need scissors to cut cloth to make uniforms for soldiers, right? When you kind of push this logic, it basically makes everything national security. And that's basically what people do, right? They try to argue that anything is in our national security. Just as an example of this, we subsidize cotton in the United States, even though the US does not have comparative advantage in cotton. That cotton subsidy is about $3 to $4 billion a year, or about $150,000 per farmer that the US government subsidizes cotton. $150,000 per Texas farmer, right? Why? Once again, it's this argument that somehow growing our own cotton is in our national interest. Well, it's in some people's interest, but I'm not so sure that it's in the national interest. Some people have tried to make the argument that you need to protect infant industries. These are young industries, new industries. And the idea is that, you know, you have to protect young industries so that they grow up and have a chance to mature, and then they'll become productive. So many people say, yeah, these infant industries, you have to protect them from trade. There's, once again, a couple of problems with this, though. What's true about most infant industries nowadays? They love trade, right? You think about the new infant industries, these are usually IT companies that love trade. They're built around trade. They love the idea of trade. What are the companies that hate trade in the United States? Coal, heavy manufacturing, right? These are not infant industries, right? These are old industries that are losing comparative advantage. And so, you know, once again, this idea that somehow new companies need to be protected from trade, it sounds good until you think about it some more, right? And as you think about it, you really realize that it's not new companies that are looking to be protected from trade. They actually usually feel, you know, they benefit from trade because they have comparative advantage. So trade gets blamed for a lot, right? And some of this is just kind of lazy thinking about trade. And then sometimes trade gets blamed for changes in technology, right? That happens all the time, right? Where changes in technology, it's easier to blame somebody from a foreign country than it is to blame technology, right? So, you know, here in Iowa, a big manufacturer used to be Amana, right? They used to make appliances in Amana, Iowa. Almost that entire Amana factory is gone now. And you know, if you lived over in Iowa or this part of Iowa for years, you've heard a lot of talking about blaming China, blaming China, blaming China. But what's the real problem with that factory? It wasn't productive anymore because it had not kept pace with new innovations in manufacturing. And so, you know, while I think a lot of people around here blame Chinese manufacturing for the loss of the jobs, in many ways, it was just changes in technology that have led to a loss of jobs there. But, you know, once again, it's easier to blame China, right? It's easier not to think very critically about this stuff and to blame another country. And I think that's a lot of what happens when it comes to discussions about trade. Let's, before I do this, let me see if this iPad is working again. Yes, no, please, please. Work, work. No, okay. It will not. So let's go back. Okay, let's return to this topic. We've talked about this before. But is it true that international trade leads to trade deficits in the United States? And really the answer is no. Our trade deficit is not a function of our trade policy. It's a function of our domestic policy. So I just want to remind us, if you remember, we developed this formula. Actually, this was on your first exam, right? Remember how we worked through the equation y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m? And we talked about how s minus I is equal to x minus m, where s is national savings, right? I is investment, and x minus m is the trade balance. So what's true about a country? Let me write this up here on the board. Sorry, let's see if I can use the board here. I don't know if you guys can all see the board. For me to go back and forth. Let's see if you can see this. Of course, the glare doesn't help either. We'll do what we can. So what's true about a country that has savings less than investment? In other words, that this is negative. It's also got to be true that exports minus imports is negative. In other words, they have a trade deficit. They have a trade deficit. So countries that save too little, right? They have low savings, this is going to tend to be true, that S minus I is going to be negative, and they're going to run a trade deficit. And they will be a net foreign borrower. They will be a net foreign borrower. Because how do you pay for the trade deficit? You pay for that trade deficit by borrowing, right, from borrowing abroad. How does the US borrow from abroad? Well, largely we borrow from abroad in the sense that who buys our treasury bonds and who buys our bonds and stocks and other financial instruments? Foreigners do. A lot of them are bought by foreigners. So this is the situation that a country like the US is in, right? And notice here, what ultimately determines the level of our trade deficit? What our savings and investment is. Our domestic policy determines the level of our trade deficit. And what's true, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, what's true about China? Well, China has the opposite situation. They have high savings relative to their investment. So the result is they tend to run a trade surplus. And they tend to be a net foreign lender. So this is the flip side of why Chinese people, Chinese government buys a lot of US assets, is it's really the flip side of running a big trade deficit with the US. That trade deficit has to be paid in some way. China is accepting US debt, right? US debt as a way to pay for this deficit. So this is essentially the position that China's in. What does US trade policy do? It impacts the level of X and level of M. So you can reduce the level of exports, you can reduce the level of imports. So it reduces the level of X and it reduces the level of M, but not the difference between X and M. That's determined by your domestic policy. So in other words, if the US starts a trade war with China, what's going to be the impact of that? The level of exports is going to go down, but also the level of imports is going to go down. It's not going to impact the difference between the two. To think of this another way, just think about what we talked about at the beginning of class. What's true about the countries that do the most exporting? They're also doing the most importing, right? So what has this trade war done? It's discouraged both ends of it. The same companies are doing less exporting and they're doing less importing. You can't discourage exports without also discouraging imports, right? That's the way that the world works. And so, you know, if you look here on this graph of the US trade deficit, what happened once Trump took over in office? The US trade deficit actually has continued to rise, right? In fact, it's risen at a faster pace than it did in the previous 4 years. Why? Because what was the thing that Trump did that had the biggest impact on the trade balance? Ran a bigger government budget deficit, right? Trump ran bigger deficits than in the previous 3 years. So what did these bigger deficits do? They reduced savings. That led to the bigger trade deficit. So the trade deficit is a reflection of domestic policy, right? It's not a function of trade policy. Trade policy impacts the level of exports, the level of imports, but it's not going to impact the difference between those two. Now, maybe you can start to get the sense of why it can be so frustrating to be an economist sometimes, right? Because after listening to 4 years of this, sometimes you want to scream you don't understand anything from Econ 101, right? And listen, I'm picking on Trump here, but I mean, the same can be said for people on both sides of the aisle, right? That this is I mean, this is just accounting, right? This is just pretty straightforward. This is the way the world actually works. And yet, many people, because it's too hard for them or they choose not to understand this, simply don't understand this, that the US trade deficit, if we were serious about getting rid of the trade deficit, what would we do? We would find a way to encourage people to save more, and we would cut our government budget deficit, right? If we were really serious about the trade deficit, that's the things we would be doing. We would not be starting a trade war with other countries, because that's only going to impact the level of trade. It's not going to impact our trade balance. Let's talk a little bit about the actual process of trade here. Your book doesn't have much to say about this, but I thought, given that most of us are probably not particularly familiar with the mechanics of trade, that I would just spend a few minutes talking about this. Okay. First of all, what governs trade? Well, trade is complex. There are a complex set of rules relating to trade, right? So basically, any country like the US has any number of different kinds of trade agreements that it's locked into. So let's start at kind of the biggest. The biggest trade agreement, meaning the one that kind of incorporates the most countries, is something called the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The WTO has 164 countries signed up to it. So, most of the world's countries belong to the WTO. Not all, but most. This document is about 24,000 pages long, so it's not a light read. But this is basically the rules of trade, right? The rules of trade. What's a legal tariff? Right? A tariff would be a tax on an import or an export. What's a legal subsidy? Meaning, can you subsidize your domestic companies? To what extent? One of the important things about the WTO, though, is the WTO has a a judicial process by which one country can charge another country with violating WTO laws. So one of the purposes of the WTO is to try to resolve trade disputes by giving people a process by which you can basically sue another country for damages. And what are those damages? Well, the only damages are that if they do something illegal, you can do something illegal back to them. It's really a tit for tat, right? So it's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination. Right? It's not a perfect system. But, for instance, the US has been accused for many years of illegally subsidizing Boeing, right? And in fact, they were found guilty. The US was found guilty of this back in 2018. And I'm trying to remember who did it. I think it was just the European Union found guilty. And as a result of being found guilty, the European Union put a tariff on US corn. Okay, so basically, you screw us, we get to screw you now. Once again, not a great system. But the idea is, once the US had tariffs put on US corn, that creates political pressure for the US to change their ways. And often that does work to some extent. Once again, it's not a great system, right? But at least there's some process by which countries can try to make other countries live up to the rules of the WTO, right? So all the time, the US has sued many other countries have sued the US, right? In fact, recently, Brazil won a big WTO ruling against US cotton, right? Yeah, this happens. And then countries have to decide, well, do I want to change this activity that was considered legal or illegal? Or do I just want to continue it and bear the price of them putting an illegal tariff on my goods? So this is, that's kind of the biggest agreement among countries. Then you have to move down to regional agreements, right? Most countries are also part of regional agreements. And by this, I mean countries that are their biggest trade partners. They'll have more regional agreements. Of course, the two most famous are the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. This is between the US and Canada and Mexico. And so today, most of the tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico have been eliminated as a result of NAFTA. NAFTA also has very detailed agreements about, the process by which things move across countries and inspections and, enforcement of illegal activities. And there's a whole bunch of other things that go into NAFTA. But I mean, for our purposes, the most important is that between the US, Canada, and Mexico, there is essentially a free trade zone, right? Essentially, not perfectly, but essentially, where you can move goods between these three countries without a cost. Likewise, the European Union, right? 28 countries essentially had a free trade zone. The European Union is actually much more ambitious than the NAFTA, because they not only standardize tariffs at 0, but also very many regulatory practices have been standardized across the countries. And this is also an agreement that allows free movement of people within the European Union, right? So countries that are in the European Union, you can go to the other country without a passport. So this is a much more ambitious agreement than NAFTA. Of course, you're all familiar with Brexit, right? And Brexit is the UK getting out of the European Union. And, this has caused all sorts of problems in England, because what it's meant is that it hasn't just meant trade has got to change with Europe, but it also means that all the regulatory practices that they have with Europe have to change, and all the immigration purposes or practices they have with Europe have had to change. So it's been a monumental task to basically break off those ties with the rest of Europe. And then you also have bilateral agreements. And bilateral means between just two countries. So for instance, the US has bilateral agreements with South Korea, and Chile, and Japan, and a number of other countries, right? And these are, I guess you would call these one-offs. Okay. What are some of the challenges to globalization nowadays? Well, I think there's really two big challenges out there. And both of these we've talked about a fair amount in this class. The first off is inequality. That particularly in a country like the US, globalization is probably contributing to domestic inequality. Why? Because of the nature of comparative advantage, right? When the US trades with other countries, some industries are going to win and other industries are going to lose. What are those industries that win? In the US, they tend to be industries that have more highly educated, right, human capital intensive workers. So, what are some of our globally dominant industries? Well, Silicon Valley, information technology, higher education, right? American colleges and universities are definitely one of the areas where we have global dominance. But of course, who tends to work in these industries? Higher paid, more highly educated people, right? So they benefit Who has been hurt by this? Well, people that work in jobs that have low skill, less human capital intensive, the kind of jobs that can really be done anywhere, right? The kind of jobs that can really be done anywhere are the kind of jobs that have been most threatened in the United States. Those also tend to be poor income Americans, lower income Americans. So here's the point I want to make. Globalization has decreased global inequality. And by that I mean, if you think about, as we've talked about when we talked about this like 2 weeks ago, if you think about the world's poor, the poorest among the world, they've been helped by globalization, right? The poorest of the poor have been helped by globalization. But if you look within the US, inequality has gotten worse because the poorest Americans in the US are more kind of middle income across the globe. And they're the people that are getting squeezed, right? So, globalization has helped rich Americans and it's helped the poor across the world, but it's tended to squeeze, lower to middle income Americans in many ways, right? And those are the people who don't have high levels of education, don't have unique skills, right? And working the kind of jobs that can be done anywhere. So, what's the solution to this? I think this is not necessarily a solution, but one approach is to spend a lot more money on job retraining and education, which unfortunately is something the US has not done, right? I mean, if we were serious about helping these people, we help them get jobs in this globalized economy, which means helping people get more specialized skills. And by that, I don't mean everybody's got to go to a 4-year college, but there might be 2-year degrees. There might be, more professional degrees. There might be degree or more training in the trades, right? That people could do. But, the US just does not spend very much on this, particularly relative to other countries. We just spend very little money on these kind of education programs. We basically ask people to fend for themselves. And that process is not working. Plain and simple, that process is not working. And then the other challenge of globalization is just simply nationalism, right? And I think that's an increasing problem here in how we talk about trade, right? And I think this is, this got worse under Trump, but it existed before, where we tend to see trade not as we both win, but more and more countries are seeing trade as I win, you lose, or you win, I lose, right? So if trade helps your country, it's got to hurt mine, right? And that's increasingly how we talk about trade, right? In other words, trade is really seen more and more kind of nationalistic terms, which is scary, right? From an economic perspective, it's scary to us economists. Now, I've spent most of our time here talking about trade, meaning movement of goods and services. But it's also important to know that a lot of globalization is movement in capital between countries. Movement in capital between countries. So it's not just goods and services that move between countries. It's actually a lot of times financial assets. So in other words, countries can borrow not just domestically, but countries can borrow from foreigners. And that's an increasingly important part of globalization. So here's looking at capital flows. This is probably a little hard for those of you here in person to see. But if you look at these lines, you can see how over time, world flows of capital have gotten bigger and bigger as a percent of GDP. Now, there's a lot of volatility here, right? They tend to go up and down a lot. But yeah, more and more capital is flowing between countries. And you can see this the same if you look at the US, both its inflows and its outflows. So the US is the world's biggest recipient of foreign capital, and we're also the world's biggest lender of foreign capital, right? So even though we borrow more than we lend, we are both the world's biggest lender and the world's biggest borrower, right? So the US is highly, highly integrated in global financial markets. And that's one of the implications of it, right? Is that the US is the world's biggest lender and the world's biggest borrower simultaneously, right? Simultaneously. Why is it that the US dominates world capital flows? Oops, sorry. Well, here, I'll do this a little bit out of order. Why is it that the US dominates world capital flows? Well, I think there's really 4 reasons, right? First off, the US just has the world's most developed financial system. And by the world's most developed financial system, I want to be clear. Not just in one area, but in many different areas. Many different areas. For instance, one area where the US has a real advantage is in bond markets, right? Most countries have a stock market. In some stock markets, they're big enough to actually rival the US stock market. But no country in the world has a bond market nearly as big or as efficient as the US bond market. And so, in particular, bonds are very, very attractive. If you want to buy bonds, the US financial markets look really strong. Both corporate bonds and government bonds, right? And then just also the diversity, right? Just the sheer diversity of the kind of financial instruments and assets that you can buy in the US just they're not rivaled other places. I mean, maybe close, like, maybe London, City of London is somewhat close. But, it's just an epicenter for financial transactions. And so that has played a big role. The US borrows a lot. So that contributes to this too, right? Our huge deficits mean that the US government pumps out a lot of bonds to be bought. That, you have to have demand, you have to have supply. And so there's a demand for government bonds, and there's also a supply of government bonds in the US because the US has these big trade deficits. Of course, the US has always been kind of a leader in globalization, in global supply chains. Maybe I should put here, and multinational corporations, right? The US, pretty much any multinational corporation of any size is going to have at least some operations in the US. So that means that US financial markets and capital flows are going to be important. And then finally, this is something we're going to talk a little bit more about this afternoon, but the US is in a very special position. And that special position is the dollar is essentially the international currency. There is no global currency out there, right? In other words, there is no currency that you can use anywhere in the world. But the one that comes by far the closest to that is the dollar, right? The dollar is as close as you can get to being the currency that you can use anywhere in the world. And as a result, this privileged position gives the dollar and the US certain privileges that no other country in the world has. And we're going to talk, as I said, we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more this afternoon when we talk about the dollar exchange rate, right? Because the dollar is different than other countries. Definitely different from other countries. Let's think a little bit here. I talked a couple of minutes ago. Let's talk about this and then we'll kind of wrap up here for the morning and take your quiz. But let's talk a little bit about the China and the US. go back to what we talked about earlier. So if you remember, still up here on the board, I can get it centered. Oh, I missed my iPad. Right, the US and China have this kind of, how would you say, codependent relationship. The US needs China, and China needs the US. Up here at the top, we know the situation. We talked about this a couple of minutes ago. That the US runs a trade deficit, and as a result is a net borrower. And China runs a trade surplus, and as a result is a net foreign saver. Right? Who benefits from this relationship? Yeah, well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this. I think if you ask most Americans, they'll say, well, China benefits and the US is getting screwed by this. But it's not nearly so clear that, like everything in economics, there is a mixture of costs and benefits associated with this. So let's talk about this, and let's first focus on China. Why is China doing this? In other words, what's the advantages for China? Well, China's doing this because of export promotion, meaning they see this as a way of creating jobs, increasing productivity, attracting technology, and getting richer in the long run. So they see international trade as absolutely the way that they improve their institutions and become richer in the long run. But this does create a lot, this comes at a cost for China, right? One of the costs for China is that China has lower standards of living than you would expect for a country that has their levels of income. Why? Because what's happening to a lot of the goods that they produce? They're going abroad, right? They're going abroad. And the imports that do come into China are quite expensive, right? They're quite expensive. So standards of living in China relative to their income levels are relatively low, right? You know, I mentioned a few times that I take a class to China every other year, take a group of Cornell students. We'll go again in block 4 of next year, right? When you guys are sophomores, could sign up for the class. I would say no. When you're seniors, you should definitely think about going, right? One of the things we do is we actually go around to people's houses and see how people live. And I think it's always a bit shocking to Americans to see, even in, you know, parts of Shanghai. Shanghai looks a lot like New York. And you can very easily forget that you're not living in a very modern American city until you actually go into people's houses. And one of the things you see is that most people really have lower standards of living than the US does. And part of this is their export promotion strategy, right? That the cost of living in China is actually relatively high for a poor country. And that's a direct reflection of the fact that most policies in China encourage people to save and they discourage consumption. And they encourage people to export, but they discourage people from importing. And so it means lower standards of living, right? It also means that China lends billions, trillions of dollars to the United States at essentially zero interest rates, right? Because the interest rates on a lot of government bonds are very close to zero. And instead of lending to Chinese people, they're lending to the US government, right? It's actually relatively difficult to borrow money in China because a lot of Chinese financial assets essentially go outside of the US, go outside of China and into the US. So it's a weird system. I mean, when you think about it this way. You have the poor country lending money to the rich country, right? It seems backwards that the poor country is lending money to the rich country. but it's the flip side of this export promotion strategy, right? It's the flip side of this export promotion strategy. And so while this creates some benefits for China, it really creates costs for China too. Costs that, quite honestly, I think a lot of economists really wonder whether the benefits are outweighing the costs at this point, right? And this is an ongoing conversation in China about to what extent China needs to rebalance its economy away from exporting everything and more towards an economy that focuses on Chinese consumers. What about for the US? Well, in many ways, it's just the opposite, right? In many ways, it's just the opposite. What do we get? We get to borrow money cheap and we get to spend it, right? That's what we like to do as Americans, right? In some sense, China is financing our binge. They lend us a lot of money and they sell us cheap stuff that we can buy. But of course, this comes with a cost. And the flip side is, this probably is some drag on employment and growth, right? It probably is some sort of drag, right? I don't want to say it's a major drag, but you know, it does create some unemployment, particularly in certain industries. And then there's also the worry about all this debt, right? The fact of the matter is that what China, in some sense, is doing is they're just giving cheap liquor to an alcoholic. They're giving cheap debt to a country that loves debt too much. At least that's one way you could possibly think about this. So, you know, the fact that it's so easy for Americans to borrow and so easy for our government to borrow might be encouraging bad behavior in the long run, right? Might be encouraging excessive debt. And so you really have to think about this relationship between China and the US, not as zero sum, like China's screwing us over or the US is going to screw China over now. And it's much more of a codependent relationship, right? That each country in the relationship, in some sense, is getting what they want, but also probably doing things that they shouldn't be doing, if that makes sense, right? So I think economists on both sides, Chinese economists, American economists, really think that in the long run, it would be better for both countries if we did some rebalancing, right? US borrowing a little bit less from China, importing a little bit less from China, doing more of its own savings. China doing a little bit less lending to the United States and a little bit more domestic consumption, and maybe relying a little bit less on exports, right? I mean, that's probably a more sustainable relationship between the two. But we don't know, right? We don't know. And of course, the other part of this that is very worrisome is just the growing nationalism between these two countries, right? So, you know, it's not just economic relations, but there's foreign policy relations between these two countries that have gotten increasingly complex. And so, yeah, there's a lot that goes into this relationship. But I wanted to talk about this once again to complicate this for you, because, as I said, too much of our public discussion about trade is very simple. I win, you lose, you're screwing me, so I'm going to screw you, this kind of stuff, right? And you've got to really understand that this is not a win-lose thing, but it's more kind of a complicated interplay where both countries win in important ways, but then also there's probably ways that they're losing in important ways. And so, you know, the ways that we're losing call for some rethinking about policy. But certainly, the rethinking that most economists don't want to see is just an outright trade war, because an outright trade war is unlikely to let either country achieve what they want to achieve, and it's just going to make things worse, not any better. So I think we should probably stop there in terms of getting ready for your quiz. So this afternoon, I just want to kind of walk you through what I'm thinking about here for the next couple of days. So this afternoon, we will meet probably for an hour, and I want to cover some more material this afternoon because I would like to not have class tomorrow afternoon, right? And give you basically kind of a study period. So my thinking is that we will meet this afternoon. for about an hour. Tomorrow morning, we will, I'll give you back your quiz number 5 and we will go over that. We will finish up chapter 18 and then we'll have a review session tomorrow morning when we're done with that, okay? So my hope is that we'll have at least a half an hour, maybe more, of morning class in the morning to review for the final exam, and I'll definitely talk more about the final exam. In fact, I could talk a little bit more about it tonight for those of you who want to start studying, or this afternoon I can talk more about it. So anyway, so that's my hope, is that we can finish up chapter 18 tomorrow, spend a little bit of time reviewing for the final, so that we do not have class tomorrow afternoon. That way you can, as I said, spend the time studying or whatever things you need to do to be ready for the final. Okay? So, all right. So before I hand you back or hand out the quiz, who's got some questions on either chapter 15 or 16 before we take the quiz? Yeah, Evan. So for those of you who are online, Evan's question was, can you define monetarizing debt? And that's just basically a way of thinking about what happens when a central bank prints up money to pay their bills, right? I mean, how does the US government pay our bills? Some of our bills, we issue bonds, right? And we take the money from those bonds and we pay our bills. But you could also monetize your debt, meaning instead of issuing bonds, you could just print up money, right? Print up money and just go buy directly the things you need. The problem with that is then it begins to push up the price level, right? So that's what I meant by monetarizing your debt. And that of course relates to debt crises and hyperinflations and all of that kind of stuff. Do you have another question?
So the reason why the supply of money in the federal funds market is vertical.
So Evan's question here was, why is the supply of funds in the federal funds market vertical? And the argument, or the reason is because it's completely controlled by the Fed. They can set the supply at whatever they want to, regardless of what the interest rate is, okay? Because they control the money supply. So remember, in the federal funds market, there's a demand for borrowing. Right? Here's the federal funds rate. And there's a supply, but the supply is basically the money supply. It's set by the Fed. Whatever the Fed wants to set the supply at, that's what they set the supply at. So it's the interplay between these things that determines the equilibrium federal funds rate. So as we talked about in chapter 16, that's why you can think about this as a target of policy, because basically the Fed can adjust this to get the federal funds rate at whatever they want, right? If the Fed wants to raise the federal funds rate, they cut the money supply. If they want to lower the federal funds rate, they increase the money supply. So the tool is open market operations to change the money supply. The target is the federal funds rate. And then that leads to the goal, remember, which is low inflation and high output. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Okay, For those of you who are online, hold on for a couple minutes because I'm going to hand out the quizzes first to everybody here, and then I'll send you an email just in a moment. So just stay on, okay?